Our store now has an Evolution of American Tanks poster in 3 colors. We've also brought back our Evolution of British Uniforms poster, as well as a few other products. Head to store.armchairhistory.tv to check it out. In this 3rd episode of our Evolution of Tanks series, we will be covering the rise of armored fighting vehicles over the 20th century in the United States. Beginning with American intervention in the First World War and leading through to the closing days of the Cold War, we will explore the evolution in American armor. Notably, however, this video will not include US tank destroyers or self-propelled guns. They will be saved for a future episode. The internet has enabled us to view huge archives of historical material from many eras. No matter how much detail is provided, however, information viewed through the screen of an electronic device will never replace the tactile feel of paper beneath your fingertips. That's why the sponsor for today's video is Historic Mail, a service dedicated to helping you connect with the past through the lost art of letter writing. How it works is simple. Every week, a stamped envelope is delivered to your doorstep, containing a lovingly crafted reproduction of a letter penned by an important historical figure. Each letter comes complete with a document of contextual information and a typed version for easy reading. Historic Mail offers material from a huge range of sources, such as the founding of the American Republic in 1776, or the correspondences between famous historical figures and world leaders of the 20th century, like the letter Albert Einstein sent to President Roosevelt in 1939 calling for action on nuclear research, which eventually led to the establishment of the Manhattan Project. A novel gift for the coming holiday season or any occasion, various gift packs are offered for different eras and topics, letting you choose the perfect surprise for any loved one who shares your passion for history. Start your journey back into the past and take advantage of an additional 10% discount by following the link in the description below. As a late ally to the Entente powers in the First World War, American reliance on French and British tanks throughout the closing days of the war came as a blessing in disguise. In 1917, General John J. Pershing set up a board to study the requirements needed for a new American tank. But a series of production complications and the armistice of 1918 left the US stuck with manufacturing a French design. These licensed-built Renault FT-17s became the optimal basis for the American 6-ton M1917. French steel-rimmed wooden idler wheels were changed to all-metal parts. The original engine was replaced with a 4-cylinder water-cooled design by Budo Engine Company, and it was armed with the Marlin Rockwell M1917 machine gun, then later Browning M1919. This design became an active part of US military experiments over the interwar period. These tests involved exercises in weapons deployment, terrain maneuvering, and modern communication trials. M1917s continued to be used in training exercises up to the late 1930s, before being sold off to neighboring allies in Canada by 1940. It was during this interwar period that military review bureaus began collaborating with companies such as Ford Motor Company and Chrysler Corporation to help fast-track development of new light and heavy tanks. It was only in 1935 that the fruit of their labor came to light with the introduction of the finalized light tank M2A1. Neatly addressing all requirements for speed and mobility, the M2A1 was fitted with a Continental radial aircraft engine, which provided enough power for the tank to sustain on-road speed of over 72 kilometers or 44 miles per hour. The M2A1's operational range could reach up to 190 kilometers or 118 miles with road access available. By the late 1930s, the M2A3 and A4 variants were in production and continued to be used sparingly in the Pacific Theater, while the remaining vehicles did their duty as training tanks. The early period of the Second World War saw a growing priority for a medium tank, something that would need to counter Axis armored designs active in Europe. This resulted in the medium tank M2. Standardized in 1939, the M2 featured the much-requested 37mm M5 gun, along with 8 multi-turreted 30 cal Browning machine guns. The M2's armor was a substantial increase from the light tanks currently being fielded, ranging from 9.5 to 25 millimeters. To transport the added weight, a Wright air-cooled radial engine was fitted, allowing for the M2 to reach on-road speeds of 42 kilometers or 26 miles per hour. Initially, there was a major push to include these tanks in the newly formed armored force under Major General Adna Chaffee in 1940, but the facilities at Rock Island Arsenal were unable to meet the demand. By August 1940, even the M2A1 contract with Chrysler Corporation was cancelled due to the new demand for a tank with a larger armament. Ultimately, the M2 would be used for training purposes only. While the American medium tank program floundered, improvements continued to be made in the light class category of tanks with the arrival of the light tank M3, known as the Stuart. While retaining the 37mm gun from the M2A4, the Stuart featured improved armor. With around 4,526 accounted for in total, many of these early production Stuarts would see themselves shipped off through Lend-Lease programs throughout the war, and even as surplus post-war. US tank development progressed with a renewed sense of urgency after the fall of France in 1940. The success of the German Blitzkrieg proved that a new era of armored warfare had arrived, and the US needed to adapt or die. With virtually no time for testing, the M3 Lee was quickly pushed into full-scale production. The M3's most important feature was the 75mm M2 and later M3 gun, capable of easily penetrating contemporary German tanks at almost any range. However, the rushed production meant that the gun had to be awkwardly mounted in the hull, while the cramped turret was fitted with a 37mm gun instead. While a true Frankenstein of design, the early production model still managed to produce over 6,200 units, with some serving until the very end of the war in the Pacific Theater. Building on lessons learned from the M3, the Ordnance Department quickly moved to create a new tank that could feasibly mount the large 75mm gun in the turret. This was the medium tank M4A1, best known as the Sherman. Set in an M34 mount, the same M3 gun used on the Lee could now traverse a full 360 degrees, letting the Sherman engage targets in any direction. By this point, the US had finally abandoned the cult of the machine gun, leaving the M4A1 with just 2 light and 1 heavy MG. The maximum armor thickness was increased to 63mm, with a top speed of 35 kilometers or 21 miles per hour, thanks to the Wright R975 radial engine. With over 6,281 models of the M4A1 alone produced, the Sherman remained an active part of all Allied armies throughout the Second World War, with some even being used in the Korean War. With the success of the newly formed M4 Shermans and ongoing M3A4 Stuarts, the demand for air-cooled radial engines forced the Army Ordnance to explore alternatives. Prototype designs began in November of 1941, using the standard M3 Stuart housing over a newer twin Cadillac V8 engine configuration. After successful trials, the new light tank M5 began production in April 1942. The new engine required the interior space to be increased and many components altered, but the M5 retained speeds of 38 kilometers or 23 miles per hour on road, with an operational range of 160 kilometers or 100 miles. Other additions, like the Hydra-Matic automatic transmissions, simplified crew training in the field. The M5 and later M5A1 variant would replace the earlier M3 light tank across the US Army, continuing to be used as the first line of equipment over the course of the Second World War. While the Sherman and Stuart proved successful, the same could not be said of the American Heavy Tank Project. Born out of initial requirements set by the Chief of Infantry Courtney Hodges in 1940, initial prototyping ran into a series of difficulties which required project oversight from the Society of Automotive Engineers. Finally, after a period of tests and trials with the T1 model, the Ordnance Department contracted Baldwin Locomotive Works to begin production of the standardized heavy tank M6 in December 1942. The vehicle was armed with a 3-inch or 76mm M7 gun, alongside a coaxial 37mm gun in the turret, with two 50 cal and two 30 cal Browning machine guns. Despite weighing nearly 60 tons and featuring up to 101mm of armor, the 960 horsepower Wright G200 radial gasoline engine allowed the M6 an on-road speed of 35 kilometers or 21 miles per hour. Unfortunately, the M6 was let down by several complications, and its armament was considered underpowered by its introduction in 1942. Due to these problems, the M6 was deemed unfit for active service and never left the working prototype stage. By 1944, American forces were involved in numerous theaters of war, having fought in North Africa, the Mediterranean, Western Europe, and the Pacific. As these theaters progressed, so did technology, with the United States primarily focusing on improving their tried and tested designs rather than shipping whole new ones across the globe. With D-Day drawing near, there was a clear need for a heavily armored assault vehicle. Army ground forces in particular were keen to get the ball rolling, and suggested the modification of existing designs to better fit the desired role. By March of 1944, the procurement of such a vehicle resulted in the newly designed M4A3E2 Sherman, or Jumbo as they were unofficially referred to in the field. Based on the M4A3 Sherman, the Jumbo featured new armored plates welded to the front hull and side sponsons. The final drive house was also given a new casting, made thicker by a maximum of roughly 140mm. On top of this, the turret's gun shield also had its armor extended to a maximum of 178mm. After production with Fisher Tank Arsenal ended in July 1944, the tanks proved successful in tests at Fort Knox and the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, and were shipped off to the European front by fall. Their effectiveness on the front lines would go on to expand military interest in applying heavier assault tank models for the remainder of the war. Alongside armor and firepower improvements from designs like the Jumbo, the US military were also pursuing changes to performance and reliability of existing models. One of the more successful variants to come out of these trials was the M4A3 76mm wet HVSS Sherman. As this was quite the mouthful, the tank was given a less formal nickname, the Easy 8. Besides the armor improvements, a more powerful Ford GAA engine, and a new 76mm gun, the Easy 8 introduced a wet ammunition stowage to reduce fires. The horizontal volute spring suspension system also provided a much smoother all-terrain performance. Thanks to all of these modifications, the Easy 8 was quickly recognized as an excellent tank even after the Second World War, finding common use in the Korean War against the T-34-85. As the Ordnance Department built and tested the T-20 series of medium tanks, the addition of heavier armor and a larger turret to hold the 90mm gun carried it over into the heavy class. By 1945, after years of difficulties, these efforts culminated in the M26 heavy tank, or Pershing. Although retaining the Sherman's general